The text message came at 3:47 a.m. Swiss time, while I was sitting in my marble-floored kitchen overlooking Lake Geneva, sipping Ethiopian coffee that cost more per pound than most people's monthly rent. The blue light from my phone cut through the pre-dawn darkness as I read the words that would change everything. Fannie, the prayer circle has decided, your lifestyle is an embarrassment to our congregation. Don't come back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at that message for what felt like an eternity, my manicured fingers trembling slightly as I held the device. 23 years. 23 years. I had tithed faithfully to Cornerstone Baptist Church back home in Cedar Falls, Iowa. 23 years of potluck dinners, vacation Bible school volunteering, and sitting in that uncomfortable wooden pew third row from the front. And this is how it ended. Not with a conversation, not with Christian love or understanding, but with a text message sent in the middle of the night like some teenage breakup. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, in my $8 million penthouse in one of the most expensive cities in the world, being told I was living in sin by people who wouldn't know a Swiss franc from a subway token. People who had never asked about my business, never wondered how the quiet bookkeeper who used to count their Sunday offerings had managed to afford anything beyond a modest ranch house in Iowa. They saw the Instagram posts from my terrace, the photos of me at charity galas in Zurich, the glimpses of my new life, and they made their judgment. Living with a man without marriage, that was their verdict. That was their sin. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that I had spent the last 3 years building something they would never comprehend. While they were gossiping over coffee and casseroles about my choices, I was managing a portfolio worth more than their entire town's annual budget. While they were deciding my eternal fate in their little prayer circle, I was creating jobs for hundreds of people across 3 countries. But none of that mattered to them. In their eyes, I was just Fannie Ellis, the spinster who had finally lost her mind and run off with some foreign man. The morning that changed my life forever started like any other Tuesday in Cedar Falls. I was 38 years old, unmarried, and working as the head bookkeeper at Midwest Agricultural Solutions, a job I'd held for 14 years. My daily routine was as predictable as Iowa weather in July. Wake up at 5:30, coffee and toast, 20-minute drive to the office in my reliable Honda Civic, 8 hours of spreadsheets and invoices, then home to my rental apartment where I'd watch cooking shows and grade Sunday school worksheets until bedtime. I lived what everyone in Cedar Falls considered a respectable life. I attended church every Sunday without fail, sitting in that same pew where my mother had sat before she passed, and her mother before that. I volunteered for every church function, from organizing the annual Christmas pageant to counting the offering every week. My life was small, predictable, and according to everyone around me, exactly what God intended for an unmarried woman approaching 40. The only deviation from this pattern was my secret obsession with financial markets. While other people my age were posting about their kids' soccer games or complaining about their marriages on Facebook, I was deep in investment forums, studying cryptocurrency trends, and reading financial reports until my eyes burned. It started innocently enough, just trying to make my modest savings grow a little faster than the pathetic interest rates the local bank offered. But somewhere along the way, it became something more. I discovered I had an intuition for patterns that others missed, ability to spot opportunities that seasoned investors overlooked. By the time I was 35, my secret portfolio was worth more than most people in Cedar Falls would see in a lifetime. Not millions, not yet, but enough to make me realize that my real talents were being wasted on small-town bookkeeping. I started taking online courses in international finance, studying market trends in emerging economies, learning languages that would help me understand global opportunities. All of this I did in complete silence, never mentioning it to my church friends, my coworkers, or anyone else in my carefully controlled world. That Tuesday morning in March, everything changed with a phone call. I was reconciling vendor payments when my phone rang, displaying an international number I didn't recognize. Normally I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Ms. Allen. The voice was accented, professional, with the kind of crisp pronunciation that suggested expensive education. "This is Klaus Brenner from Meridian Capital Management in Zurich. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." I nearly dropped the phone. Meridian Capital was one of the most exclusive investment firms in Europe, the kind of place that managed money for people whose names appeared in Forbes magazine. I had been following their strategies for years, studying their public filings like sacred texts, but I had never imagined they knew I existed. "I'm calling because your recent analysis of the Southeast Asian agricultural technology sector caught our attention," Klaus continued. "Specifically, your prediction about the palm oil futures market collapse 3 months before it happened. We'd been tracking your investment patterns for some time, and frankly, we're impressed." I sat there in my cubicle surrounded by filing cabinets and motivational posters about teamwork, trying to process what I was hearing, my analysis, my prediction. Someone had been watching, someone had been paying attention to the work I did in my spare bedroom, between Sunday school lessons and church committee meetings. "We have a proposition for you," Klaus said. "We're expanding our agricultural commodities division, and we need someone with your particular insights, someone who understands both the technical aspects of farming and the broader market forces at play. The position would require relocation to Switzerland, but the compensation package would be quite substantial." The number he mentioned made my vision blur. It wasn't just substantial, it was life-changing. It was more money than I could make in 20 years of bookkeeping in Cedar Falls. It was enough to buy the kind of freedom I had only dreamed about during those long Iowa winters when the sky stayed gray for weeks and the most exciting thing to happen was a new flavor of pie at the church bake sale. "I need to think about it," I managed to say, though every cell in my body was screaming yes. "Of course," Klaus replied smoothly. "Take your time, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this have a tendency to disappear if left unattended. I'll email you the details, and perhaps we can arrange a video call later this week to discuss the specifics." After he hung up, I sat motionless for nearly 10 minutes, staring at my computer screen but seeing nothing. Around me, the office continued its mundane rhythm. Patricia from accounts receivable was complaining about her husband's snoring. Jim from purchasing was arguing with a supplier about late deliveries. The coffee machine was making that grinding noise that meant it needed cleaning again. Everything was exactly as it had been 5 minutes earlier, but somehow the entire world had shifted on its axis. That evening I drove home through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, past the high school where I'd graduated 20 years ago, past the Dairy Queen where I'd had my first job, past the Methodist church where I'd been baptized as a child before my family switched to Cornerstone Baptist. Everything looked smaller somehow, like a movie set designed to represent small-town America rather than an actual place where people lived real lives. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could about Meridian Capital, about Switzerland, about the legal requirements for Americans working abroad. I read every article, every financial report, every piece of information I could find. What I discovered was that this wasn't just a job offer, it was an invitation into a completely different universe. Meridian Capital managed portfolios worth billions. Their clients included tech billionaires, oil executives, and European royalty. The agricultural division I would be joining was responsible for investments that affected food prices across 3 continents. The video call with Klaus happened on Friday evening, after I'd gotten home from work and changed out of my conservative blouse and sensible shoes. He appeared on my laptop screen looking like Central Casting's idea of a Swiss banker, impeccably dressed, silver-haired, with eyes that seemed to see through everything. Behind him was an office that looked like it belonged in a James Bond movie, all glass and steel with a view of mountains that made Iowa's landscape seem embarrassingly flat. We talked for nearly 2 hours. He explained the position in detail, outlining how my role would involve analyzing agricultural trends in developing markets, identifying investment opportunities in sustainable farming technologies, and managing a portfolio focused on food security issues. It was everything I had been preparing for without realizing it, all those late nights, studying market reports finally making sense. "The learning curve will be steep," Klaus warned. "You'll be working with some of the brightest financial minds in Europe, people with degrees from Oxford and Harvard, people who speak 4 languages and have been doing this work since before you were born. Are you prepared for that challenge?" I thought about my life in Cedar Falls, about the safety of routine and the comfort of never being tested beyond my limits. I thought about growing old in that same rental apartment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Attending the same church, having the same conversations about the weather and local gossip until the day I died. Then I looked at Klaus through the screen, at the possibility he represented, at the chance to finally use all the knowledge I'd been accumulating in secret. When would you need an answer? I asked. Monday, he said, without hesitation. I know it seems fast, but in our business, hesitation is expensive. If you're serious about this opportunity, you'll need to be prepared to relocate within 6 weeks. We'll handle all the visa paperwork and provide temporary housing until you find something permanent. The first year will be challenging, but if you prove yourself, the rewards will be beyond anything you've imagined. That weekend, I drove around Cedar Falls like a tourist in my own life, seeing everything with new eyes. I stopped by the church on Saturday to check on the flower arrangements for Sunday's service, a task I'd been doing for so long it felt like breathing. Mrs. Henderson was there, rearranging the white lilies for the third time because they weren't quite perfect enough for her standard. Fannie, dear, she said without looking up from the flowers, Pastor Williams mentioned you've been looking a little distracted lately. Is everything all right? You know we're all here for you if you need to talk about anything. The concern in her voice was genuine. I knew that. Miss Henderson had been like a surrogate mother to me, since my own mother passed 5 years earlier. She was the one who brought me casseroles when I had the flu, who remembered my birthday when everyone else forgot, who had taught me how to arrange flowers for church services in the first place. The idea of leaving her, of leaving all of them, felt like betrayal. I'm fine, I said, adjusting a lily that didn't need adjusting, just thinking about some changes I might need to make. Changes? Mrs. Henderson finally looked up, her weathered hands still holding a flower stem. What kind of changes? You're not thinking of moving, are you? This community needs you, Fannie. You're one of our pillars. A pillar. That's what I was to them. A reliable structure that held things up. Something solid and unchanging that people could depend on to always be. The image should have been comforting, but instead it felt suffocating. Pillars don't move, don't grow, don't explore new possibilities. They just stand in place, supporting other people's dreams. Sunday's service was particularly difficult. I sat in my usual pew, surrounded by people I'd known my entire life, listening to Pastor Williams deliver a sermon about being content with God's plan for our lives. He spoke about the dangers of ambition, about how the pursuit of worldly success could lead us away from our true purpose. Every word felt like it was directed specifically at me, like somehow he knew about the offer sitting in my email inbox, waiting for my response. After the service during the fellowship hour in the church basement, I found myself surrounded by the usual group of women my age, most of them married with children, all of them part of the social fabric that held our small community together. They talked about their kids' activities, their husbands' jobs, their plans for summer vacations to lakes in Minnesota, or visits to relatives in neighboring states. I listened and nodded and made appropriate comments, but inside I felt like I was observing them from a great distance, like an anthropologist studying a culture I no longer quite belonged to. Fannie, said Sarah Mitchell, balancing her toddler on her hip while reaching for a sugar cookie, we should get together for lunch this week. I feel like we never get to really talk anymore. Sarah had been my best friend in high school, back when we dreamed about escaping Cedar Falls and seeing the world together. She'd gotten pregnant senior year and married her boyfriend instead, settling into the life that everyone expected. Now at 38, she looked tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep, worn down by the endless cycle of caring for other people's needs while forgetting her own. I'd like that, I said, and meant. Sarah deserved to know what I was considering, deserved the chance to understand why I might be leaving. We'd been through too much together for me to just disappear without explanation. We met for lunch on Wednesday at the Bluebird Cafe, the only restaurant in Cedar Falls that wasn't part of a chain. Sarah ordered the chicken salad sandwich she always ordered, and I got the soup of the day, which was potato and leek, just like it had been every Wednesday for the past 10 years. We talked about safe topics at first, the weather, mutual friends, the church's upcoming spring festival, but eventually the conversation turned to more personal territory. "You seem different lately," Sarah said, stirring sugar into her iced tea. "Distant, maybe, like your mind is somewhere else." I looked at my oldest friend, at the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there in high school, at the wedding ring she twisted when she was nervous, a habit I'd noticed becoming more frequent over the years. How could I explain to her that I spent my evenings studying European agricultural markets? How could I tell her that I had been offered a job that would pay more in 1 year than her husband made in 5? How could I describe the feeling of possibility that had been growing in my chest like a bird trying to escape its cage? "I've been thinking about making some changes," I said carefully, "maybe traveling more, exploring new opportunities." Sarah's face brightened. "That sounds wonderful. You should definitely take more vacations. Remember how we used to talk about going to Europe together? Maybe we could finally plan that trip. I'd have to save up for a while, and it would depend on finding someone to watch the kids, but it could be fun." The innocent excitement in her voice broke my heart. She was thinking about a 2-week tourist trip, postcards and hotel rooms and guided tours of famous landmarks. I was thinking about relocating permanently to a different continent, starting a career that would require learning new languages and navigating cultures I'd only read about in books. "Sarah," I said slowly, "what if I told you I was thinking about moving away? Not just traveling, but actually leaving Cedar Falls for good." The color drained from her face. "Moving where? And why? Your whole life is here, Fannie. Your job, your church, your friends. What could possibly be worth giving all that up?" I couldn't tell her about the money, couldn't explain that I had discovered talents and abilities that were being wasted in our small town. Instead, I focused on something she might understand. "I feel like I'm disappearing. Like every day I become a little more invisible, a little more forgotten. When I die, what will people remember about me? That I kept accurate books, that I arranged flowers nicely, that I never caused any trouble or made any waves." Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. "You're having a midlife crisis," she said with the kind of gentle certainty that came from years of friendship. "It's normal, everyone goes through it, but running away isn't the answer. What you need is to find more purpose here, maybe take on more responsibility at church, or start dating again. When's the last time you even tried to meet someone?" Dating, the suggestion would have been laughable if it weren't so sad. Cedar Falls wasn't exactly bursting with eligible bachelors, and the few single men in my age range were either recently divorced and bitter about it, or had never married for reasons that became obvious after 5 minutes of conversation. Besides, dating would just be another way of defining myself in relation to other people's expectations, another role to play in the ongoing drama of small-town respectability. "It's not about finding a man," I said. "It's about finding myself." Sarah squeezed my hand tighter. "You don't need to find yourself, Fannie. You're right here. You're our friend, our community member, our sister in Christ. Why isn't that enough? Why wasn't it enough?" That was the question I'd been asking myself for months, the question that had driven me to spend countless hours studying financial markets and dreaming about possibilities beyond the boundaries of Iowa. The truth was, I had outgrown the person everyone expected me to be, but I hadn't figured out how to become the person I wanted to be, without hurting the people who loved the old version of me. That evening, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open, Klaus's email displayed on the screen. The offer was still there, still valid for another few days. All I had to do was type yes, hit send, and everything would change. Or I could close the laptop, go to bed, wake up tomorrow and continue living the life that everyone assured me was perfectly adequate. I thought about my mother, about the dream she'd given up to marry my father and raise children in the same town where she'd been born. I thought about the journal I'd found after she died, filled with sketches of places she'd wanted to visit, languages she'd wanted to learn, adventures she'd never had the courage to pursue. I thought about Sarah, trapped by circumstances she'd created in high school, still talking about someday traveling to Europe like it was an impossible fantasy rather than a simple matter of buying a plane ticket. I thought about the sermon Pastor Williams had delivered the previous Sunday, about being content with God's plan. But what if God's plan wasn't about staying safe and comfortable? What if it was about using the gifts He'd given me, even if it meant disappointing people who preferred me small and manageable and permanently available for their needs. I opened a new email and began to type, "Dear Klaus, thank you for your patience. I am pleased to accept your offer and look forward to joining the team at Meridian Capital. Please let me know the next steps in the relocation process." I read the message 3 times before hitting send, my finger hovering over the button for what felt like an eternity. Once I sent it, there would be no going back. Once I sent it, I would have to tell people, make explanations, face the disappointment and confusion and judgment that would inevitably follow. I hit send. The response came within an hour, professional and efficient, outlining the timeline for my move and the paperwork I would need to complete. Reading Klaus's instructions made everything feel suddenly real in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. In 6 weeks, I would be boarding a plane to Switzerland. In 6 weeks, my life as Fannie Ellis, small-town bookkeeper and dependable church volunteer, would effectively end. The next few days passed in a blur of logistics and lies. I gave my boss at Midwest Agricultural Solutions 2 weeks' notice, citing family obligations that required my immediate attention. I started researching temporary housing in Zurich, international banking procedures, and the requirements for obtaining a Swiss work permit. I made lists of things to sell, things to store, and things to pack for my new life. All of this I did in secret, maintaining my normal routine while quietly dismantling the infrastructure of my existence in Cedar Falls. The hardest part was telling the church. I waited until after the Wednesday evening prayer meeting, when most people had gone home and only the core group of dedicated volunteers remained, cleaning up and preparing for Sunday's service. Pastor Williams was in his office, reviewing his sermon notes, when I knocked on his door. "Fannie," he said, looking up with the warm smile he reserved for his most reliable parishioners. Come in. What can I do for you this evening?" I sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd sat for countless conversations over the years about church business, volunteer schedules, and the occasional personal crisis. The office smelled like coffee and old books, familiar and comforting, like everything else about my life that I was about to leave behind. "Pastor Williams," I began, my carefully rehearsed speech suddenly feeling inadequate. "I need to tell you that I'll be leaving Cedar Falls. I've accepted a job opportunity that requires me to relocate." His expression shifted from warm welcome to concern. "Relocate where? And what kind of job opportunity? I hope you haven't been approached by one of those companies that promise quick money but turn out to be scam. There are a lot of predators out there targeting women in your situation." My situation? Unmarried. Approaching 40, presumably desperate enough to fall for any scheme that promised escape from spinsterhood. The assumption stung, but I tried to keep my voice level. "It's a legitimate position with an international investment firm," I said. "I'll be working in their agricultural commodities division." Pastor Williams leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for theological discussion. "Fannie, I have to ask, is this really about a job? Or is this about something else? Sometimes when people reach a certain age, especially women who haven't married, they start feeling like they need to make dramatic changes to find meaning in their lives. But running away isn't the answer. Your purpose is here, with your church family, serving God in the community where He placed you." The condescension in his voice was gentle but unmistakable. He was speaking to me like I was a confused child rather than an adult who had made a carefully considered decision based on opportunities he couldn't even comprehend. For a moment, I considered trying to explain the real scope of what I'd been offered, the level of responsibility and compensation involved. But I realized it wouldn't matter. In his worldview, a woman's highest calling was to serve others quietly and without ambition, to find fulfillment in supporting other people's dreams, rather than pursuing her own. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but this is something I need to do. I'll be submitting my resignation from all my volunteer positions, effective at the end of this month." Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with how to respond. Finally he leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone he used for serious counseling sessions. Fannie, I've known you since you were a teenager. You've been one of our most dedicated members, someone we've all relied on and appreciated. But I'm worried that you're making a decision based on worldly temptations, rather than spiritual wisdom. The Bible warns us about the love of money being the root of all evil. Are you sure this opportunity isn't leading you away from God's plan for your life? The love of money. There it was. The assumption that my decision was motivated by greed rather than ambition, by materialism rather than the desire to finally use my abilities to their fullest potential. He couldn't conceive that I might have talents worth developing beyond the narrow scope of what Cedar Falls had to offer, or that God's plan for my life might involve something bigger than arranging flowers and counting offering envelopes. I'll be attending services until I leave, I said, standing up from the chair. And I'll make sure all my responsibilities are properly transferred to other volunteers. I don't want to leave anyone in a difficult position. As I walked out of his office, I heard him call after me. The door is always open, Fannie. When you realize that happiness can't be found in worldly success, you'll always have a home here. The words followed me out of the church and into the parking lot, where I sat in my car for several minutes trying to process what had just happened. The man who had baptized me, who had delivered my mother's eulogy, who had counseled me through every major decision of my adult life, had just dismissed my choice as a spiritual failing. He couldn't see that I might be following God's call rather than running from it, that maybe my talents were meant for something larger than the comfortable confines of small-town ministry. Over the next 2 weeks, word spread through the church community with the speed and accuracy of a telephone game. By the time the news reached everyone, the story had been simplified and distorted into something more palatable to their understanding. Fannie Ellis was having a midlife crisis. She had been seduced by promises of easy money. She was running away from her responsibilities to chase impossible dreams. The details of my actual opportunity were lost in the narrative, replaced by a cautionary tale about the dangers of discontent and ambition. The reactions ranged from concern to disappointment, to barely concealed judgment. Mrs. Henderson cried when I told her, begging me to reconsider and offering to pray for my confused heart. Sarah stopped speaking to me entirely after our final lunch, where she accused me of betraying our friendship and abandoning everyone who cared about me. Other church members approached me with increasingly urgent warnings about the spiritual dangers of putting career before faith, about the loneliness and emptiness that awaited people who chose worldly success over Christian community. The worst part was that some of their concerns resonated with fears I'd been carrying since the moment I accepted Klaus's offer. Was I making a terrible mistake? Was I destroying relationships and abandoning responsibilities for the sake of an opportunity that might prove to be an illusion? Late at night, alone in my apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes, I wondered if Pastor Williams was right, if I was being led astray by pride and ambition rather than following a legitimate calling. But then I would remember the feeling of recognition I'd experienced during that first phone call with Klaus. The sense that finally, after years of hiding my abilities and minimizing my ambitions, someone was offering me the chance to become who I was meant to be. I would think about my mother's journal, about Sarah's resigned acceptance of limitations, about the comfortable cage that Cedar Falls represented, and I would continue packing. My last Sunday at Cornerstone Baptist was awkward and painful. Pastor Williams preached about the prodigal son, emphasizing the parts about leaving home and squandering inheritance in a distant country. The congregation sang hymns about finding peace in God's will and trusting in His plan. During the fellowship hour, people approached me with final attempts to change my mind, sharing stories about people they'd known who had left small towns for big cities and found only disappointment and regret. Through it all, I maintained a polite smile and thanked everyone for their concern while privately counting the hours until I could escape. These were people who had shaped my life for nearly 4 decades, who had celebrated my achievements and comforted me through losses, who genuinely believed they were acting in my best interest. But they couldn't see beyond the boundaries of their own experience, couldn't imagine that their definition of a meaningful life might not be the only valid option. The morning I left Cedar Falls, I drove through the town one last time, saying goodbye to the landscape of my childhood and young adulthood. I passed the elementary school where I'd learned to read, the high school where I'd discovered my aptitude for mathematics, the library where I'd spent countless hours researching investment strategies while everyone assumed I was reading romance novels. I drove past Sarah's house, where she was probably getting her children ready for school, and past the church where people were already preparing for Wednesday evening prayer meet. At the airport in Des Moines, I checked 2 suitcases and carried on a laptop bag containing everything I thought I'd need for my new life. As the plane lifted off, I watched Iowa disappear beneath the clouds and tried to imagine what Switzerland would look like, what my colleagues would be like, what kind of person I would become in a place where no one knew my history or had expectations about who I should be. The flight to Zurich was long and gave me plenty of time to second-guess my decision. Somewhere over the Atlantic, surrounded by strangers speaking languages I didn't recognize, the magnitude of what I'd done finally hit me. I had left everything familiar for the promise of something better, burned bridges I'd spent a lifetime building for the chance to discover what lay on the other side of safety and comfort. There was no going back now, no way to undo the choice I'd made without admitting that everyone in Cedar Falls had been right about my foolishness and their wisdom. When the plane touched down in Zurich, I was no longer just Fannie Ellis from Iowa. I was someone new, someone undefined, someone whose story was just beginning. The possibilities were terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but for the first time in my life they were entirely my own to explore. My first month in Switzerland was a masterclass in humility wrapped in designer clothing and served with artisanal coffee. Klaus had arranged for me to stay in a corporate apartment in the Seefeld district while I found permanent housing, a sleek 1-bedroom space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake that cost more per week than my entire monthly rent in Cedar Falls. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was living in more luxury as a temporary resident than I'd ever experienced as a homeowner in Iowa. The Meridian Capital offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed architecture should make statements about human ambition. My first day, I arrived 45 minutes early, wearing my best suit from J.C. and carrying a briefcase I'd bought specifically for this job. The security guard in the marble lobby spoke to me in German, then French, before finally switching to English when my blank stare made it clear I was hopelessly American. Klaus met me in the elevator, looking exactly as polished as he had on our video call but somehow more intimidating in person. He was the kind of man who made expensive clothes look effortless, whose handshake conveyed both warmth and the subtle reminder that he held all the power in our relationship. "Welcome to Zurich, Fannie," he said as we rode up to the 17th floor. "I trust your flight was comfortable and the apartment meets your needs." I nodded, still struggling with the surreal nature of my situation. 3 weeks ago, I'd been calculating payroll taxes for farm equipment salesmen. Now I was ascending through a Swiss skyscraper to begin a career I'd only dreamed about during those late nights in my Cedar Falls apartment. The agricultural commodities division occupied half of the 17th floor, an open-concept workspace where 30-something Europeans in tailored suits spoke quietly into headsets, while monitoring screens displaying real-time market data from around the world. Klaus led me to a corner office with a view of the lake and the Alps beyond, a space larger than my entire apartment back home. "This will be your office," he said, gesturing toward a desk that probably cost more than my Honda Civic. "Your assistant, Marie, will help you get settled with the computer systems and introduce you to the team. We have a client presentation next Friday that I'd like you to observe, just to get a feel for how we operate." The next few hours were a blur of introductions, system passwords, and information overload. My colleagues were polite but clearly curious about the American hire who had materialized seemingly from nowhere. Most of them had degrees from prestigious European business schools, spoke 3 or 4 languages fluently, and possessed the kind of casual sophistication that comes from growing up with easy access to culture and opportunity. There was Dimitri, a Greek economist who had written his dissertation on water rights in developing nations. Isabella, an Italian woman who spoke 6 languages and had spent 2 years in Kenya analyzing agricultural sustainability projects. Andreas, a Swiss native who knew more about global grain markets than anyone had a right to know, and who explained complex derivatives trading like he was discussing the weather. "So Fannie," Isabella said during my first team lunch at a restaurant where the menu was entirely in French and the cheapest entree cost 50 Swiss francs, Klaus mentioned you have experience with American agricultural markets. Where did you study? Wharton, Northwest. I took a careful sip of wine that probably cost more per glass than I used to spend on groceries in a week. Actually, I'm self-taught. I worked in agricultural accounting for 14 years and developed an interest in market analysis as a hobby. The silence that followed was polite but telling. In their world, credentials mattered. Academic pedigree was the entry fee to serious conversations about serious money. My Midwestern practicality and self-directed education marked me as an outsider in a way that went deeper than nationality. That's fascinating, Dmitri said finally, his tone suggesting it was anything but. It's unusual for firms like Meridian to hire outside traditional academic channels. Klaus must have seen something quite exceptional in your work. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into learning everything I could about how Meridian operates. I studied their investment strategies, analyzed their past successes and failures, and spent long evenings in my corporate apartment reading research reports and financial analyses until my eyes burned. Slowly, I began to understand the scope of what I'd gotten myself into. Meridian didn't just manage money, they moved markets. Their agricultural commodities division controlled investments worth billions of dollars, money that influenced food prices from Chicago to Shanghai. When they decided to buy palm oil futures, plantations in Malaysia expanded production. When they shifted away from corn investments, farmers in Argentina planted soybeans instead. I wasn't just analyzing markets anymore, I was becoming part of a machine that shaped global food systems. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. In Cedar Falls, the most significant decision I'd made was which vendor to recommend for the church's new sound system. Now I was being asked to evaluate investment opportunities that could affect the livelihoods of millions of people I'd never meet in countries I'd never visited. My breakthrough came during my third week when Klaus asked me to review a proposed investment in vertical farming technology in Southeast Asia. The company, Agritech Solutions, was seeking $50 million to expand their operations in Singapore and Thailand, promising revolutionary advances in urban food production. I spent 2 days analyzing their business model, studying their technology, and researching the regulatory environment in their target markets. What I found troubled me. The company's projected returns were based on assumptions about consumer behavior that didn't align with what I knew about Asian food preferences. Their technology was impressive, but their understanding of local markets was superficial at best. When Klaus asked for my assessment, I hesitated. This was my first major evaluation, and disagreeing with a deal that other team members supported could mark me as difficult or overly conservative. But I thought about the farmers I'd known in Iowa, about the practical realities of food production that these Swiss financiers might not fully grasp. I think we should pass, I said during the team meeting, my voice steadier than I felt. The technology is sound, but they're overestimating market demand and underestimating cultural resistance to artificial growing methods. Urban consumers in Singapore might embrace vertical farming, but expansion into rural Thailand will face significant obstacles they haven't adequately planned for. Andreas frowned at his tablet where he'd been taking notes. Their projections show substantial growth potential across the entire region. The demand for locally grown produce is increasing throughout Southeast Asia. The demand exists, I agreed, but not necessarily for this type of produce grown in this way. Thai consumers have strong preferences for traditional farming methods, especially for vegetables and herbs. Vertical farming might work for lettuce and tomatoes, but it won't work for the aromatic herbs that make up a significant portion of the local diet. The company's market research focused on urban centers, but didn't adequately survey rural populations, who represent 60% of their target demographic. The room was quiet for a moment. I could see Isabella and Dmitri exchanging glances, probably wondering how the new American hire had access to insights they'd missed. Klaus, however, was leaning forward with interest. Explain, he said simply. For the next 20 minutes I walked them through my analysis, drawing on everything I'd learned about agricultural markets, consumer behavior, and cultural food preferences. I explained how my years working with American farmers had taught me to look beyond technical capabilities to practical adoption challenges. I showed them demographic data they'd overlooked and cultural factors their European perspective had minimized. When I finished, Klaus was smiling in a way that made me think of a chess player who had just seen his strategy validated. "Excellent work," he said. "This is exactly the kind of analysis we hired you for. Andreas, please draft a polite decline to Agritech Solutions and schedule a follow-up call with their competitors who might have better market understanding." After the meeting, Klaus asked me to stay behind. Once the conference room was empty, he closed the door and sat down across from me. "That was impressive," he said. "You saw things the rest of the team missed, and you had the courage to disagree with the consensus. Both qualities are rare and valuable in this business." I felt a flush of pride that was immediately tempered by nervousness. "I hope I wasn't overstepping. I know I'm still learning how things work here." Klaus waved dismissively. "Overstepping would be making the decision yourself. What you did was provide the information we needed to make the right decision. There's a significant difference." He paused, studying me with the same intensity I'd noticed during our first video call. "I'm curious about something. Your analysis demonstrated knowledge about Southeast Asian food culture that goes well beyond what most agricultural economists would possess. How did you acquire that expertise?" I felt heat rising in my cheeks. The truth was embarrassing but not something I could lie about. I spent a lot of time in ethnic restaurants in Cedar Falls. There was a Thai family who ran a small place downtown, and I became friends with the owner's daughter. She taught me about traditional cooking methods and ingredient preferences. I also did extensive online research about regional food systems as part of my investment studies. Klaus laughed, a genuine sound of appreciation. "You learned about Southeast Asian agricultural markets by befriending restaurant owners in Iowa. That's either the most unconventional research method I've ever heard, or the most brilliant, possibly both." Over the following months, I established myself as the team member who could bridge the gap between financial theory and practical agricultural reality. While my colleagues analyzed spreadsheets and market projections, I focused on understanding the human elements that drove those numbers. I studied farming communities, researched cultural food preferences, and developed networks of contacts who could provide insights that didn't appear in official market reports. My success brought both opportunity and scrutiny. Klaus began assigning me larger projects, more complex analyses, and greater responsibility for client presentations, but I also noticed increased attention from colleagues who seemed puzzled by my rapid advancement and unconventional background. The scrutiny intensified when I recommended against a major investment in African grain futures that the rest of the team strongly supported. My analysis indicated that political instability in the region would disrupt supply chains within 6 months, making the investment far riskier than the potential returns justified. When the political crisis materialized exactly as I'd predicted, causing massive losses for our competitors who had invested heavily in the same markets, my reputation within Meridian shifted from curiosity to respect. It was around this time that I received the first text message from Cornerstone Baptist Church. The message appeared on my phone during a client dinner, interrupting a conversation about sustainable cocoa farming in Ghana. I excused myself to the restroom and read the words that transported me instantly back to Cedar Falls. "Fannie, this is Dorothy Henderson. We've been praying for you and wanted you to know that your position as head of the flower committee is still available when you're ready to come home. We understand that sometimes people need to explore the world before they appreciate what they have." The message was meant kindly. I knew that. Mrs. Henderson genuinely believed she was offering comfort and hope to someone who must be struggling with loneliness and regret in a foreign country. But the assumption underlying her words that I would inevitably realize my mistake and return to my previous life stung more than any direct criticism could have. I deleted the message without responding and returned to the dinner table, where my colleagues were discussing the potential for blockchain technology to revolutionize supply chain tracking in agricultural markets. The conversation was exactly the kind of forward-thinking analysis that energized me, that made me feel like I was contributing to solutions for real-world problems rather than just maintaining other people's status quo. More messages followed over the next few weeks. Pastor Williams sent scripture verses about contentment and the dangers of worldly ambition. Sarah forwarded Facebook posts about the importance of family and community, always with comments like "thinking of you" or "hope you're finding what you're looking for." The church prayer circle sent a group message informing me that they were praying for my spiritual guidance and safe return to Iowa. Each message felt like a small anchor trying to drag me back to a version of myself I'd outgrown. The senders meant well, but they couldn't conceive that I might actually be thriving in my new life, that I might have discovered talents and opportunities they'd never imagined possible. In their minds, I was lost and needed rescuing rather than found and finally flourishing. The breaking point came when I received a package from Cedar Falls containing items I'd left behind, along with a letter from the church board formally requesting that I reconsider my life choices and return to serve God in a more appropriate manner. The letter, signed by Pastor Williams and 6 board members, was respectful but firm in its condemnation of my current path. "We are concerned," the letter read, "that your pursuit of worldly success has led you away from the Christian values that once guided your life. We understand that the temptations of wealth and status can be powerful, but we urge you to remember that true fulfillment comes only through service to God and community. Your talents are needed here in the place where God has called you to serve." I read the letter 3 times, sitting in my Zurich apartment with its lake view and modern furnishing, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd built through my own efforts and abilities. The audacity of their judgment astonished me. They were telling me that using my God-given talents to their fullest potential was somehow less faithful than hiding them under the modest expectations of small-town respectability. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding since my arrival in Switzerland. I opened my laptop and began researching the financial status of Cornerstone Baptist Church. What I found was both shocking and infuriating. The church was in serious financial trouble. Their mortgage was underwater, their maintenance fund was empty, and they owed nearly $30,000 in deferred repairs to the building. Pastor Williams was working without salary, relying on his wife's teaching income to support their family. The congregation was aging and shrinking, unable to attract younger families who might revitalize both the membership and the finances. But more disturbing was what I discovered about the church leadership's personal finances. Several board members, including those who had signed the letter condemning my pursuit of worldly success, were drowning in debt. Credit card balances, medical bills, and underwater mortgages painted a picture of people who were barely managing their own financial responsibilities while presuming to judge my choices. I thought about the years I'd spent volunteering my time and expertise for free, keeping their books balanced and their financial systems organized. I remembered the countless hours I'd donated to fundraising events, building maintenance, and administrative tasks that kept their organization running. They had benefited from my skills for nearly 2 decades without ever acknowledging that those same skills might have value beyond their immediate needs. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They condemned my pursuit of financial success while struggling with their own money management. They accused me of abandoning Christian values while failing to practice basic stewardship of their own resources. They claimed I was being led astray by worldly temptations while their own lives demonstrated the stress and limitation that came from financial instability. I closed my laptop and walked out onto my balcony where the lights of Zurich sparkled across the lake like scattered diamonds. 6 months ago, I'd been living paycheck to paycheck in a rental apartment, attending a church whose leadership couldn't balance their own checkbook. Now I was managing millions of dollars in investments, contributing to global food security initiatives, and earning more money than I'd ever imagined possible. The contrast wasn't lost on me. In Cedar Falls, I'd been praised for my faithfulness while my talents were systematically underutilized and undervalued. In Zurich, I was respected for my expertise and compensated accordingly for the value I created. Which situation better honored the abilities God had given me? That night, I made a decision that would have shocked my former church community. Instead of responding to their letter with explanations or apologies, I began planning something that would demonstrate exactly how far I'd traveled from the person they thought they knew. I started with a detailed financial analysis of Cornerstone Baptist Church, using the same methodologies I applied to potential investments. I identified their core problems, evaluated their assets, and developed a comprehensive plan for financial recovery. Then I researched similar churches that had successfully navigated financial crises and documented the strategies they'd employed. The analysis took me 3 weeks to complete, working evenings and weekends while maintaining my regular responsibilities at Meridian. When I finished, I had created a 40-page report that outlined specific steps the church could take to eliminate their debt, increase their revenue, and build sustainable financial practices for the future. The plan was aggressive, but achievable. It involved selling unused property, consolidating their programs, implementing modern fundraising techniques, and developing new revenue streams through community partnership. I estimated that if they followed my recommendations consistently, they could be debt-free within 18 months and financially stable within 3 years. But I wasn't planning to send them the report, at least, not yet. Instead, I began implementing a different strategy. Using connections I'd developed through Meridian's network, I identified 3 potential sources of funding for struggling rural churches. One was a foundation that supported community development in small towns. Another was a grant program focused on historic preservation, which applied to Cornerstone's century-old building. The third was a private donor who specialized in faith-based community initiatives. I spent weeks crafting grant applications and funding proposals, careful to present Cornerstone Baptist Church as worthy of investment, without revealing my personal connection to the organization. I used my professional credentials and Meridian's reputation to lend credibility to their cause, positioning them as an example of the kind of rural institution that deserved support from urban wealth. The process was more complex than anything I'd ever attempted, requiring me to navigate legal restrictions, tax implications, and administrative procedures across multiple jurisdictions. But my work at Meridian had taught me how to manage complex financial arrangements, and I applied those skills to engineering a solution for the church that had rejected me. 3 months after I'd received their condemning letter, I had secured funding commitments totaling $65,000 for Cornerstone Baptist Church, enough to cover their immediate debts, complete necessary building repairs, and establish a modest endowment for future stability. The money would arrive through official channels, with no indication of my involvement in the process. I also arranged for a consultant to visit Cedar Falls and deliver my financial recovery plan to the church leadership, presenting it as standard practice accompanying the grant funding. They would receive exactly the help they needed to solve their problems, provided by someone they'd dismissed as spiritually misguided and morally compromised. The irony was exquisite. While they prayed for my return to Christian values, I was demonstrating those values in ways they couldn't recognize or appreciate. While they worried about my soul, I was using my worldly success to secure their future. While they condemned my choices, I was proving that my path had led to exactly the kind of generous service they claimed to value. But I still wasn't ready to reveal my role in their salvation. That revelation would come later when the timing was right, and the lesson was complete. For now, I was content to watch from Switzerland as the people who had judged me received an anonymous gift that would preserve their community and validate their faith. The real test would come when they learned the truth about who had saved them. Would they recognize the hand of God working through the very path they had condemned? Would they acknowledge that my pursuit of worldly success had enabled a level of Christian generosity they couldn't achieve through their own means? Or would they find new reasons to justify their prejudices and maintain their sense of moral superiority? I suspected I already knew the answer, but I was willing to give them the chance to surprise me. After all, grace was supposed to be transformative, and transformation required the possibility of being wrong about fundamental assumptions. As winter settled over Zurich and my first year at Meridian progressed, I found myself becoming someone I'd never been before. Not just professionally, but personally, I was confident in ways that went beyond financial success, comfortable with ambiguity and complexity in ways that small-town certainty had never allowed. I started dating a colleague from the London office, a brilliant economist named James, who spoke 4 languages and had never lived anywhere for more than 3 years. Our relationship was sophisticated and challenging, built on intellectual compatibility and mutual respect rather than shared history or social expectation. We traveled together to conferences in Singapore and Sao Paulo, discussing sustainable agriculture over meals that cost more than most people's weekly salaries. James knew nothing about my background in Cedar Falls, and I found that refreshing to him. I was simply Fannie Ellis, agricultural commodities specialist, a woman who belonged in the world we both inhabited. He never questioned whether I fit into elite financial circles or whether my success was somehow inappropriate for someone of my gender or background. In his experience, competence was the only qualification that mattered. The relationship felt adult in ways that my previous romantic encounters never had. We respected each other's careers, supported each other's ambitions, and maintained individual identities while building something together. There was no pressure to conform to traditional relationship scripts or sacrifice professional goals for domestic expectations. When James mentioned that he was considering relocating to Zurich permanently, I realized that I was ready to take our relationship to the next level. Not marriage necessarily, but cohabitation, shared responsibilities, the kind of partnership between equals that I'd never thought possible during my years in Cedar Falls. We found a penthouse apartment in Seefeld with panoramic views of the lake and mountains, a space designed for entertaining and sophisticated enough to reflect our combined status in Zurich's financial community. The rent was astronomical by Iowa standards, but easily manageable with our combined incomes. We furnished it with modern art, and expensive wine and furniture that looked like it belonged in architectural magazines. I was happy in ways I'd never imagined possible. My work was challenging and meaningful, my relationship was fulfilling and supportive, my social life was rich with interesting people who respected my intelligence and valued my contribution. I had found exactly the kind of life that small-town conventional wisdom insisted was impossible for women like me, which made the messages from Cedar Falls increasingly difficult to tolerate. They continued to arrive sporadically, always carrying the same underlying assumption that I must be miserable and lonely, that my success must be hollow and my happiness must be fake. The persistent refusal to accept that I might actually be thriving felt like a form of psychological violence, a determined effort to undermine my confidence and drag me back to limitations I'd outgrown. The final straw came on my birthday, when I received a care package from the church prayer circle containing homemade cookies, devotional materials, and a letter expressing their continued hope for my spiritual recovery. The package arrived on the same day James surprised me with a weekend trip to Vienna, where we attended a conference on sustainable investing and celebrated my promotion to senior analyst at Meridian. Sitting in our 5-star hotel in Vienna, surrounded by evidence of a life built on mutual respect and shared ambition, I opened the care package from Cedar Falls and felt something inside me finally snap. Not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity about the choice I needed to make. I could continue accepting their judgment definitely, allowing their disapproval to shadow my happiness and their expectations to define my sense of worth, or I could finally definitively claim my right to live the life I'd chosen, without apology or explanation. That night, after James had fallen asleep, I sat at the hotel desk and composed a response that I'd been crafting in my mind for months. Not a defense of my choices or an explanation of my success, but a simple statement of fact that would close the door on their attempts to reclaim me for their version of righteousness. The message was brief and direct. I am living the life God intended for me. Please stop trying to save me from my blessings. I sent the message to the church group text and then blocked every number associated with Cornerstone Baptist Church. No more prayers for my misguided soul. No more care packages designed to remind me of what I'd left behind. No more attempts to make me feel guilty for choosing growth over safety. I was done being their cautionary tale. It was time to become my own success story, complete and unapologetic and entirely beyond their power to diminish or reclaim. The next morning, James and I had breakfast overlooking the Danube, planning our next investment research trip and discussing the apartment renovations we wanted to complete before hosting our first dinner party. It was a conversation between equals about a future we were building together, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. For the first time since leaving Iowa, I felt completely free from the weight of other people's expectations. I was exactly where I belonged, with someone who valued me for who I'd become rather than mourning who I'd been. The life I'd built was mine to celebrate, and I was finally ready to do exactly that. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, slipped under my office door like a piece of evidence in a crime I didn't know I'd committed. I found it when I arrived early to prepare for a presentation to the Meridian Executive Board, my coffee still steaming as I bent to pick up what I assumed was a misdelivered document. Instead, I found myself staring at a grainy image printed on cheap paper, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. James and I were captured exiting our apartment building, his arm around my waist, both of us laughing at something he'd just whispered in my ear. We looked happy, intimate, completely unaware that we were being observed and documented like subjects in a surveillance operation. On the back, someone had written in block letters, "Living in sin in Switzerland." Below that, in the same careful handwriting, "Your mother would be ashamed." My hands were shaking as I turned the photograph over again, studying the image for clues about who might have taken it, and how they'd managed to deliver it to my office in Zurich. The picture was recent, probably from the previous week based on the coat I was wearing. Someone had been watching me, following me, documenting my private life for purposes I could only imagine. I sank into my desk chair, the presentation I'd been preparing suddenly feeling insignificant compared to the violation I held in my hands. Someone from Cedar Falls had found me. More than that, they'd traveled to Switzerland, located my home and workplace, and were now conducting some form of surveillance operation, designed to intimidate me back into compliance with their moral expectations. The timing wasn't coincidental. It had been 3 months since I'd blocked the church's phone numbers and stopped responding to their messages, 3 months since I'd claimed my right to live without their judgment or interference. Apparently, my silence had been interpreted as a challenge rather than a boundary, prompting someone to escalate their efforts to reclaim me for their version of righteousness. I thought about calling building security, but what would I tell them? That someone had taken a photograph of me in public and delivered it to my office with a Bible verse. Technically, no crime had been committed. The real violation was psychological, an invasion of privacy designed to make me feel exposed and vulnerable in the life I'd built for myself. The worst part was the reference to my mother. She had been dead for 6 years, beyond their ability to recruit her for their campaign of moral correction. But they knew exactly how to weaponize her memory, how to make me question whether I was honoring or betraying the woman who had raised me to be respectful, modest and content with whatever life offered. I spent the morning's presentation distracted and off my game, stumbling through slides about palm oil futures, while my mind raced with questions about who might be watching me and what they might do next. Klaus noticed my uncharacteristic nervousness, and asked to speak with me afterward, his expression concerned rather than critical. "You seemed unsettled today," he said, closing his office door behind us. "Is everything all right?" Personal issues can affect professional performance, and I'd rather address problems early than watch them escalate. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about my situation. Klaus was sophisticated and cosmopolitan, comfortable with the kind of lifestyle choices that scandalized my former church community, but he was also my employer, someone who needed to trust my judgment and stability. How could I explain that I was being stalked by religious extremists without sounding paranoid or unstable? "I received some unwelcome contact from people back home," I said carefully, "nothing threatening, exactly, but intrusive enough to be concerning." Klaus leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for complex investment decisions. "Define intrusive." I pulled the photograph from my briefcase and handed it to him, watching his face as he studied the image and read the inscription. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of emotion he allowed himself in professional settings. "This was delivered to your office?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Slipped under my door sometime between last night and this morning." Building security didn't see anyone unusual, but the cameras in our corridor have been malfunctioning for the past week. Klaus set the photograph on his desk and steepled his fingers, a gesture I'd learned meant he was processing information and formulating a response. "Do you have any idea who might be responsible? Former colleagues, family members, anyone with both motive and means to travel to Switzerland?" I explained about the church situation, about the messages I'd been receiving, and the pressure to return to Iowa. I told him about blocking their communications and the escalation that had apparently followed. As I spoke, I watched his expression grow colder, more focused, like a predator identifying a threat to something he was determined to protect. "Religious harassment," he said finally. "We've seen this before with other American employees who've relocated to Europe, Small-town communities sometimes react strongly when members escape their influence. Usually it's family members, but religious organizations can be equally persistent. The casual way he discussed my situation was both reassuring and disturbing. On one hand, it suggested that what I was experiencing wasn't unique or insurmountable. On the other hand, it implied that Meridian had enough experience with this type of problem to have developed protocols for handling it. "What do you recommend?" I asked. Klaus was quiet for a moment, studying the photograph again. "First, we involve our security consultant. Meridian maintains relationships with firms that specialize in executive protection and privacy issues. They'll evaluate the threat level and recommend appropriate countermeasures." He paused, his gaze meeting mine directly. "Second, you need to understand that this firm protects its assets, and you've become a valuable asset. We don't allow anyone to interfere with our employees' ability to do their jobs effectively. If these people want to play games, they'll discover that our resources for winning such games far exceed anything they can imagine." The implicit threat in his words should have troubled me, but instead I felt a rush of relief. For the first time since receiving the photograph, I wasn't facing the situation alone. Meridian's resources, their connections, their sophisticated understanding of how to handle complex problems, were now aligned with my interests. "There's one more thing," Klaus continued. "I'm recommending you for promotion to managing director of our North American agricultural division. The position comes with additional compensation, expanded responsibilities, and certain perquisites that include enhanced security protocol." I stared at him, trying to process the implications of what he'd just said. Managing director was a senior executive position, the kind of role that came with seven-figure compensation and global responsibility for billion-dollar investment strategy. It was beyond anything I'd imagined possible when I'd first accepted his job offer 18 months earlier. "Klaus, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of responsibility. I've only been here for a year and a half." He smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from him during our conversation. "Fannie, you've already demonstrated more practical insight into agricultural markets than colleagues with decades of experience. Your analysis has saved us from several costly mistakes and identified opportunities that generated substantial returns. The promotion isn't charity, it's recognition of value already delivered." He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the lake while he continued speaking. "The position would require relocating to our New York office for 6 months each year, with the remainder of your time split between Zurich and field research in agricultural regions worldwide. The compensation package starts at $800,000 annually, with performance bonuses that typically double that amount." $800,000. More money than everyone in Cedar Falls combined would see in multiple years. More financial security than I'd dreamed possible during those nights in my Iowa apartment, studying market reports and imagining a different kind of life. "The position also comes with certain lifestyle benefits," Klaus continued. "Company housing in Manhattan, access to executive security services, and legal support for any personal issues that might arise, including harassment from former associates who don't understand professional boundaries." The message was clear: accept the promotion, and Meridian would handle my stalker problem with the kind of resources and expertise that could make it disappear permanently. Continue in my current role, and I'd be fighting this battle with limited support and uncertain outcomes. "I accept," I said without hesitation. Klaus turned back from the window, his expression satisfied.
"Excellent.
"We'll announce the promotion next week and begin your transition immediately. In the meantime, I'm arranging for a security consultation this afternoon. The consultant will review your living situation, assess potential vulnerabilities, and recommend protective measures." The security consultant arrived at my apartment that evening, looking like someone from Central Casting's idea of an elite operative. Marcus Webb was tall, professionally dressed, and carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested extensive experience with situations most people only encountered in movies. His business card listed no company name, just his name and a phone number. "Brenner briefed me on your situation," he said, declining my offer of coffee as he began a systematic examination of my apartment. "Religious harassment cases can escalate quickly, especially when the perpetrators believe they're acting on divine authority. People who think God is on their side often feel justified in crossing boundaries that would restrain ordinary stalkers. He moved through my living space with practiced efficiency, checking sightlines from windows, examining locks and security systems, photographing potential vulnerabilities with a tablet that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The photograph was taken from the building across the street, he continued, positioning himself at my bedroom window and pointing toward a rooftop access door. Professional equipment, probably rented rather than owned. Whoever did this has some technical sophistication, but limited experience with actual surveillance work. James arrived home during Marcus's security assessment, immediately understanding the situation when he saw a stranger methodically documenting our living space. To his credit, he adapted quickly to the intrusion, offering assistance and asking intelligent questions about protecting our privacy. "Are we in physical danger?" James asked, his accent more pronounced than usual, a sign of stress I'd learned to recognize. Marcus paused his examination to consider the question seriously. "Unlikely, but not impossible." Religious extremists typically focus on psychological pressure rather than physical violence, but they're also unpredictable because they operate according to belief systems rather than rational cost-benefit analysis. He completed his assessment and sat down with us at our dining table, pulling out a tablet to review his findings. "Your current security is adequate for typical urban threats, but insufficient for determined surveillance. I'm recommending several upgrades." The list of recommendations was extensive and expensive. New locks, security cameras, window treatments that blocked outside observation, and a comprehensive alarm system that connected directly to a private security firm. He also suggested modifications to our daily routines, varying departure and arrival times, and using different routes to avoid establishing patterns that could be exploited by observers. "The total cost will be approximately 40,000 Swiss francs, Marcus concluded. "Meridian has authorized full payment as part of your executive security package. 40,000 francs for protection against people who believed they were saving my soul." The irony was staggering, but I approved the expenditures without hesitation. If my former church community wanted to play surveillance games, they would discover that their amateur efforts were no match for professional countermeasures, backed by serious money. The security upgrades were completed within a week, transforming our apartment into something resembling a diplomatic residence. Cameras monitored every approach, sensors detected movement in hallways, and reinforced locks secured every possible entry point. Marcus provided us with panic buttons and secure communication devices, treating our safety with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for protecting heads of state. Meanwhile, Klaus had been conducting his own investigation into my harassment situation. Meridian's resources included relationships with private investigation firms, legal experts, and technology specialists who could trace communications and identify perpetrators with impressive efficiency. "We've identified your photographer," Klaus informed me during our weekly one-on-one meeting. Harold Mitchell, a private investigator from Des Moines with a specialty in what he calls moral documentation cases. "He was hired by someone in your former church community, though we haven't yet determined the specific client." He handed me a file containing Harold's photograph, background information, and a detailed timeline of his activities in Zurich. The man looked exactly like Central Casting's idea of a small-town private detective, middle-aged and slightly overweight, with the kind of mustache that suggested he'd learned his profession from television shows rather than formal training. "Mr. Mitchell returned to Iowa 3 days ago," Klaus continued, "but not before visiting several other locations where you might have been vulnerable to surveillance: your office building, your gym, the restaurants you frequent. He was quite thorough in documenting your lifestyle for his client's evaluation." The violation felt even worse knowing the extent of Harold's surveillance operation. He hadn't just taken one photograph. He'd conducted a comprehensive investigation into my personal life, gathering evidence that would be used to support whatever judgment my former church community was preparing to render. "There's more," Klaus said, his expression growing grimmer. "Mr. Mitchell's client paid him to deliver something else, but he apparently had second thoughts about completing that particular assignment. He returned to Iowa with the package unopened." He slid another photograph across his desk, this one showing Harold Mitchell at Zurich's airport, carrying a manila envelope and looking distinctly uncomfortable. Our security consultant believes the package contained something more serious than Bible verse, possibly legal documents, possibly something designed to intimidate you more directly. The implication hung in the air between us. Someone in Cedar Falls had planned an escalation beyond simple surveillance, something serious enough to make even a hired private investigator uncomfortable about delivering it. Whatever they'd intended, my promotion and the security measures that came with it had apparently disrupted their timeline. What happens now? I asked. Klaus smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. Now we demonstrate that harassment has consequences. Meridian doesn't typically involve itself in employees' personal disputes, but when those disputes affect our business interests, we respond appropriately. He explained that the firm's legal team was preparing a comprehensive response to the harassment campaign. Cease and desist letters would be sent to Harold Mitchell and anyone else who could be identified as participating in the surveillance operation. More significantly, they were researching the tax-exempt status of Cornerstone Baptist Church, looking for any irregularities that might warrant investigation by federal authority. Churches enjoy certain legal protections, Klaus explained, but those protections depend on maintaining appropriate boundaries between religious activities and personal harassment. When religious organizations begin conducting surveillance operations against private citizens, they risk losing their tax-exempt status and facing federal scrutiny. The prospect of my former church facing federal investigation because of their campaign against me felt both satisfying and disturbing. I'd wanted them to stop interfering with my life, but I hadn't intended to destroy their organization in the process. Despite everything they'd done, these were still people I'd known for decades, people who genuinely believed they were acting in my best interests. Klaus, I said carefully, I appreciate Meridian's support, but I don't want to ruin innocent people's lives. Most of the congregation probably doesn't even know about the surveillance operation. He nodded approvingly, as if my reluctance to pursue nuclear options was exactly what he'd expected. Which is why our initial response will be measured and focused. We're not targeting the entire congregation, just the individuals responsible for crossing legal boundaries. If they cease their activities immediately, the situation can be resolved quietly. If they escalate, we'll escalate proportionally. The conversation left me feeling both protected and troubled. Meridian's resources were vast and their commitment to defending me was absolute, but the power they wielded was also somewhat frightening. I was beginning to understand that my promotion wasn't just recognition of my professional achievements, it was also initiation into a level of influence and protection that came with its own moral complexity. That evening, James and I had dinner at a restaurant in Old Town, trying to maintain some normalcy while adapting to our new reality of security protocols and surveillance concerns. Our conversation was subdued, both of us processing the implications of our transformed circumstance. Do you ever regret leaving Iowa? James asked during dessert, his question carrying more weight than casual curiosity. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman I'd been 18 months earlier and the life I'd been living before Klaus's phone call changed everything. I regret that it had to end this way, I said finally. I regret that people I cared about couldn't accept my choices without turning them into a moral crusade. But I don't regret the choices themselves. James reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture of support that had become more frequent since the harassment began. Your former church doesn't understand what they've lost, he said. Their judgmental attitude has cost them someone who could have been a tremendous asset to their community. His observation was astute but incomplete. The church hadn't just lost my potential contributions, they'd actively driven away someone who had already demonstrated loyalty and generosity. The anonymous funding I'd arranged for their financial problems was still working its way through bureaucratic channels, money that would save their organization from the very people who had condemned me for earning it. The irony was becoming more delicious with each passing day. While they prayed for my spiritual recovery and plotted ways to document my moral failures, I was using my worldly success to preserve their earthly institution. When the funding finally arrived, they would celebrate it as divine intervention, never knowing that their salvation had come from the person they'd declared lost to sin and materialism. But my patience for their ignorance was wearing thin. The surveillance operation had crossed a line from annoying interference into genuine violation, And the package that Harold Mitchell had been too uncomfortable to deliver suggested even worse intention. Whatever Christian love had originally motivated their concern for my soul had been corrupted into something vindictive and potentially dangerous. 2 weeks after the security upgrades were completed, Marcus Webb contacted me with an update on his investigation. The news was both better and worse than I'd expected. "We've identified the source of your funding," he said during a secure phone call from his office. Pastor Williams and 3 church board members pooled their resources to hire Harold Mitchell. The total payment was $12,000, which represents a significant financial commitment for people in their income bracket. $12,000. They'd spent more money on surveilling me than most of them probably had in their savings accounts, demonstrating a level of obsession that went far beyond normal concern for a former congregant's welfare. The financial sacrifice also suggested that their campaign against me was being treated as a religious obligation rather than a personal preference. "There's more," Marcus continued. "We've obtained copies of the communications between Harold Mitchell and his client. The surveillance operation was phase 1 of a larger plan designed to document your lifestyle and gather evidence for what they call intervention proceedings." He explained that the church leadership had been planning to confront me publicly with evidence of my sinful lifestyle, possibly through social media or direct contact with my employer. The package that Harold had refused to deliver contained printed materials describing my living situation and demanding that I choose between my career and my salvation. "The intervention was scheduled to coincide with your mother's birthday," Marcus added. "They apparently believed that date would have maximum emotional impact and increase the likelihood of compliance with their demands." My mother's birthday. They were planning to weaponize the anniversary of her birth to manipulate me into abandoning the life I'd built, treating her memory like a tool in their psychological warfare campaign. The calculated cruelty of the timing revealed something ugly about their motivations, something that had nothing to do with Christian love and everything to do with the need to control someone who had escaped their influence. "What about the package Harold refused to deliver?" "Still in his possession, as far as we can determine. He appears to have developed ethical concerns about the assignment, possibly because the materials crossed the line from religious concern into harassment. We're monitoring his communications with the church leadership, who seem frustrated by his reluctance to complete the job they paid for." The image of Harold Mitchell, small-town private investigator, struggling with the moral implications of delivering whatever poison my former church had prepared for me, was almost comical. Even someone who made his living documenting other people's secrets had boundaries that my supposedly Christian community was willing to cross. "What do you recommend?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "Professionally, I recommend a preemptive strike. Contact Harold Mitchell directly, offer to purchase the undelivered package, and make it clear that continuing the surveillance operation will result in legal consequences he can't afford. Simultaneously, we document everything and prepare for potential escalation." The strategy made sense from a security perspective, but it also represented a fundamental shift in my relationship with my past. Instead of passively enduring their harassment, I would be actively confronting it, using resources they couldn't match to defend boundaries they refused to respect. "Set up the meeting," I said. 3 days later, I was sitting in a conference room at Meridian's Zurich office, connected via secure video link to Harold Mitchell in his cramped office in Des Moines. The contrast between our environments was stark and symbolic. I was surrounded by contemporary luxury and sophisticated technology, while he sat behind a cheap desk in what looked like a converted strip mall storefront. Harold Mitchell looked even smaller and more uncomfortable than his surveillance photographs had suggested. He was sweating despite the cool temperature, and his eyes kept darting away from the camera as if he couldn't bear to maintain direct visual contact with me. "Miss Mitchell," I began, my voice carefully controlled, "I understand you have something that belongs to me." He shifted in his chair, clearly unhappy about the direction his assignment had taken. "Look, Ms. Ellis, I want you to know that I'm just a working man trying to make a living. I don't have anything personal against you or your lifestyle choices, but you do have a package that was intended for me," I continued. "A package you were paid to deliver but chose not to complete that delivery. I'm prepared to compensate you for that package, and for a written statement describing the exact nature of your assignment." Harold glanced off camera, probably checking notes or consulting with someone else present in his office. The package contains personal materials that the client believed you should see, religious materials mostly, along with some financial documents, and family photographs. Financial document. That was new information, suggesting that my former church community had been researching my business affairs as well as my personal life. The violation felt even more comprehensive and invasive than I'd previously understood. What kind of financial documents? I asked. Harold's discomfort was palpable even through the video connection. Investment records, property purchases, bank account information. The client wanted to document how much money you're making and how you're spending it. They said it was evidence of corruption, of how money had changed you from the person you used to be. They'd been investigating my finances, probably through public records and possibly through more intrusive means. The level of obsession revealed by their research operation was both frightening and pathetic, suggesting people who had lost all sense of proportion in their crusade to reclaim my soul. "Miss Mitchell," I said, my voice taking on the kind of authority I'd learned to project during high-stakes negotiations, "you're going to provide me with that package and all copies of any materials you've gathered. In exchange, you'll receive compensation of $25,000 and a written agreement that protects you from any legal liability related to this assignment." His eyes widened at the sum I'd mentioned. $25,000 was probably more than he made in a good year, certainly enough to solve whatever financial problems had motivated him to accept the surveillance assignment in the first place. "What about my clients?" he asked. "They paid me to complete a job." "Your clients commissioned you to commit acts that border on criminal harassment," I replied. "Continuing that assignment exposes you to potential federal charges related to stalking and invasion of privacy. The compensation I'm offering provides you with a graceful exit from a situation that could destroy your business and your personal reputation." I could see him processing the implications of what I'd said, weighing the immediate financial benefit against the potential long-term consequences of continuing his original assignment. The decision was obvious for anyone with basic survival instinct. "I'll need the agreement in writing," he said finally. "It's already being prepared by our legal department," I assured him. "You'll receive the documents and the payment within 48 hours of providing the materials I've requested." The transaction was completed smoothly and professionally, with Harold Mitchell proving surprisingly cooperative once he understood the scope of what he was dealing with. The package he'd been hired to deliver contained exactly what he'd described: religious pamphlets about the dangers of worldly success, financial records documenting my income and investment, and family photographs that had apparently been provided by church members as emotional manipulation tools. But the most disturbing item was a formal letter from the church board, addressed to Klaus Brenner and the executive leadership of Meridian Capital. The letter detailed their concerns about my moral character, described my living situation as inconsistent with Christian values, and requested that the firm reconsider my employment based on their assessment of my spiritual condition. They'd been planning to contact my employer directly, trying to destroy my career as punishment for my refusal to return to their version of righteousness. The letter was carefully worded to avoid direct libel, but the intent was unmistakable. They wanted to cost me my job as consequences for my lifestyle choices. The audacity was breathtaking. People who couldn't balance their own checkbooks were preparing to lecture one of Europe's most successful investment firms about employee character standards. People who'd spent $12,000 on a surveillance operation were positioning themselves as moral authorities qualified to judge my fitness for professional responsibility. Reading their letter, I felt the last traces of affection and loyalty I'd maintained for my former community finally evaporate. These weren't misguided friends concerned about my welfare. They were vindictive zealots determined to destroy my life because I'd escaped their control. They deserved whatever consequences their actions brought upon them. I forwarded the letter to Klaus and Marcus Webb, along with all the other materials Harold Mitchell had provided. Within hours, Meridian's legal team was preparing a comprehensive response that would demonstrate exactly how seriously they took threats against their employees. The next phase of the conflict was about to begin, and this time I wouldn't be playing defense. The call came at 4 in the morning, jolting me from sleep with the aggressive urgency of an international emergency.
I fumbled for my phone in the darkness, my mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios involving family tragedies or business crises that couldn't wait for daylight. The voice was breathless, panicked, barely recognizable as Sarah Mitchell. "Oh God, Fannie, I'm so sorry, I never wanted this to happen, you have to believe me." I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hours. Sarah hadn't spoken to me in over 2 years, not since I'd left Cedar Falls, and she'd accused me of abandoning everyone who cared about me.
Hearing her voice now, raw with desperation and terror, sent ice through my veins. "Sarah, what's wrong? What's happened?" "The church," she sobbed, her words barely coherent through the tears. "They've destroyed everything. My marriage, my reputation, my children's lives. Harold told them, you paid him off, and now they're saying, I was part of some conspiracy to help you escape God's judgment." I was fully awake now, my mind racing to process the implications of what she was telling me. Harold Mitchell had apparently violated his confidentiality agreement, exposing our transaction to the very people I'd been trying to neutralize. The consequences were cascading through Cedar Falls like a shockwave, destroying innocent people who'd had nothing to do with the surveillance operation. "Sarah, slow down. Tell me exactly what happened." Through her broken sobs, the story emerged in fragments. Harold Mitchell, apparently overwhelmed by guilt or perhaps threatened by the church leadership, had confessed to accepting my payment and turning over the harassment materials. But in his confession, he'd also claimed that Sarah had provided him with inside information about my emotional vulnerabilities, painting her as a co-conspirator in my corruption, rather than an unwilling victim of the church's investigation. Pastor Williams had used Harold's confession to launch a comprehensive purge of anyone suspected of maintaining contact with me or showing insufficient commitment to the church's moral crusade. Sarah, already vulnerable because of our childhood friendship, had been branded as a traitor to the community's spiritual welfare. Her husband, faced with pressure from his own family and employer, had filed for divorce and was seeking full custody of their children. "They're calling me a Jezebel," Sarah wept. "They're saying I helped corrupt you and that my children need to be protected from my influence. Tom's mother is telling everyone that I'm morally unfit to be a mother, that I've been secretly envious of your sinful lifestyle and wanted to escape my Christian duty." The accusations were absurd and vicious, but I understood their logic within the closed ecosystem of small-town religious politics. Sarah had become a convenient scapegoat, someone whose destruction could serve as both punishment for my escape and warning to anyone else who might consider following my example. "Where are you now?" I asked, already calculating what resources I could deploy to help her. "Motel outside town. Tom changed the locks yesterday and took the kids to his mother's house. My own mother won't even speak to me. The bank called this morning about our mortgage payments, and I don't even know if I still have access to our account." She was homeless, financially cut off and socially isolated, facing the complete destruction of her life because of her association with me. The guilt hit me like a physical blow, even though I knew rationally that I wasn't responsible for the church's vindictive response to their failed harassment campaign. "Sarah, listen to me carefully. I'm going to help you, but you need to stay calm and follow my instructions exactly. Can you do that?" "I don't want your money," she said, her voice suddenly sharp with the kind of pride that comes from desperation. "That's what got me into this mess in the first place. Everyone thinks you've been corrupting me with your worldly success, and taking your help now will just prove them right." "This isn't about proving anything to them," I said firmly. "This is about protecting you and your children from people who've lost all sense of proportion. They've turned you into a casualty in their war against me, and I won't let them destroy you to make a point about my choices." James stirred beside me, awakened by my side of the conversation. I mouthed emergency and pointed toward the kitchen, indicating that I needed privacy for this call. He nodded and slipped out quietly, understanding that whatever was happening required delicate handling. "Sarah, I need you to trust me one more time. Remember when we were 16 and you trusted me to help you when you thought you might be pregnant? Remember how I didn't judge you or lecture you or make you feel worse than you already did? That was different," she whispered. "We were kids making mistakes. This is about eternal salvation and moral choices." "No," I said with conviction that surprised me. "This is about the same thing it's always been about. People with power using fear and judgment to control people without power. You're being destroyed because they can't destroy me directly, and that's not about God or morality or salvation. That's about human cruelty dressed up in religious language. The silence stretched between us across thousands of miles, filled with the weight of everything we'd shared and lost over the years. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice smaller but less hysterical. "What do you want me to do?" I spent the next hour walking her through a carefully planned escape strategy that Marcus Webb had helped me develop for exactly this type of situation. Emergency funding would be wired to a new bank account I'd set up in her name, enough to cover immediate needs and legal representation. A family law attorney in Des Moines would contact her within hours to begin protecting her parental rights and challenging her husband's precipitous divorce filing. Most importantly, she would be relocated temporarily to a safe location where the church's influence couldn't reach her while we developed a longer-term strategy for rebuilding her life. The arrangements were complex and expensive, but they were also necessary to protect someone who'd become collateral damage in a conflict she'd never chosen to join. After ending the call with Sarah, I sat in my kitchen watching the sun rise over Lake Geneva and contemplating the moral complexities of my situation. My success had given me the power to protect people like Sarah, but it had also made me a target for exactly the kind of vindictive persecution that now threatened to destroy her. Was I responsible for the consequences my escape had brought upon others, or was I obligated to use my resources to shield them from persecution I'd never intended to provoke? James found me an hour later, still sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold as I stared out at the water. He'd dressed for work but hadn't left for the office, apparently sensing that the early morning phone call had shifted something fundamental in our carefully ordered world. "Bad news from home?" he asked, pouring himself coffee and settling into the chair across from me. I explained about Sarah's situation, about the church's escalating campaign against anyone associated with me, about the impossible position I found myself in as both the cause and potential solution to her problem. James listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer as the scope of the situation became clear. "These people have completely lost perspective," he said finally. "They're destroying their own community to punish you for succeeding beyond their expectations. It's madness." "It's worse than madness," I replied. "It's systematic persecution disguised as religious conviction, and it's going to get worse before it gets better." I was right about the escalation. Over the next few days, Marcus Webb's intelligence network provided a steady stream of updates about the situation in Cedar Falls. The church leadership had used Sarah's exile as justification for expanding their purge to include anyone who'd ever expressed doubt about their campaign against me. 3 families had left the congregation, rather than submit to what Pastor Williams was calling spiritual accountability sessions. 2 church board members had resigned in protest over the leadership's increasingly authoritarian approach to moral enforcement. The church's attendance had dropped by nearly 40% as people either fled or were expelled for insufficient loyalty to the anti-Fannie crusade. Most disturbing was the news that Pastor Williams had begun reaching out to other evangelical churches in the region, sharing information about my corruption and warning them about the spiritual dangers I represented. He was attempting to organize a broader coalition dedicated to exposing and condemning my lifestyle, turning his local obsession into a regional movement. "He's creating a network," Marcus warned during one of our secure communications. "Religious organizations that share information about individuals they consider morally problematic. Your name is being circulated among churches across Iowa and neighboring states as someone to be watched and opposed." The systematic nature of their campaign was both impressive and terrifying. They weren't just expressing disapproval of my choices. They were building infrastructure to monitor and punish anyone who might be influenced by my example. I'd become the subject of an organized religious resistance movement, dedicated to proving that escape from their value system was impossible. The breaking point came when I learned that Pastor Williams had contacted my elderly aunt in Minnesota, my mother's sister who'd remained neutral throughout the conflict with the church. He'd informed her about my sinful lifestyle and pressured her to use her family relationship to convince me to return to Iowa for spiritual intervention. My Aunt Margaret had been my closest remaining family connection, someone who'd maintained loving contact with me throughout my transition to Switzerland without judging my choices or demanding explanation. She was 83 years old, living alone in a retirement community, and struggling with early stages of dementia that made her vulnerable to manipulation and confusion. When Margaret called me, crying and asking whether the terrible things Pastor Williams had told her about my life were true, I felt something inside me finally break. Not anger exactly, but a cold clarity about the kind of people I was dealing with and the lengths they were willing to go to inflict damage on anyone connected to me. "Aunt Margaret," I said gently, "Pastor Williams is lying to you. I'm living a good life with someone who loves me, doing work that helps people around the world. I'm healthy and happy and surrounded by friends who care about me." "But he said you're living in sin," she whispered, her voice trembling with the confusion of someone whose cognitive capacity was being exploited by people who claimed moral authority. "He said your mother would be heartbroken if she could see what you've become." The calculated cruelty of using my aunt's declining mental capacity and her grief over my mother's death as weapons in their campaign against me revealed something monstrous about their motivation. These weren't people acting out of Christian love or genuine concern for my welfare. They were predators using religious language to justify their need to control and punish anyone who escaped their influence. "Aunt Margaret, I need you to promise me something. If Pastor Williams or anyone from that church contacts you again, I want you to hang up the phone and call me immediately. Can you do that?" "I'm scared, Fannie," she admitted. "I don't understand what's happening or why everyone is so angry. I just want our family to be together and happy again." That evening, I made a decision that I knew would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the conflict. Instead of continuing to respond defensively to their attacks, I would take the initiative and expose their campaign for what it really was: systematic harassment disguised as religious conviction. I called Klaus and Marcus into my office for an emergency strategy session, spreading out documentation of everything the church had done across my conference table like evidence in a criminal prosecution. The surveillance operation, the planned career sabotage, the destruction of Sarah's life, the manipulation of my elderly aunt, the systematic purging of their own congregation, the attempts to organize regional opposition to my existence. "This has gone beyond personal harassment," I told them. "They're building a network dedicated to destroying anyone who doesn't conform to their interpretation of moral behavior. It's not just about me anymore, it's about establishing their right to control other people's lives through religious intimidation." Klaus studied the documents with the kind of focused intensity he usually reserved for major investment decisions. "What are you proposing?" "Complete exposure. We document everything they've done, package it professionally, and release it to media outlets that specialize in religious abuse stories. We make their campaign so public and so obviously inappropriate that they can't continue without facing serious consequences." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Media exposure is the most effective weapon against organizations that depend on community reputation. Churches like this one survive because people assume their activities are legitimate expressions of religious faith. Public scrutiny tends to reveal the difference between genuine spiritual concern and psychological manipulation." "There's something else," I continued. "I want to reveal my role in providing the anonymous funding that saved their church from bankruptcy. Let them explain to their community how they've been persecuting the person who prevented their organization from collapsing financially." The proposal was risky and irreversible. Once I exposed their hypocrisy publicly, there would be no possibility of reconciliation or peaceful resolution. I would be declaring war on people who'd once been central to my life, using resources they couldn't match to defend principles they'd abandoned. But I thought about Sarah, homeless and separated from her children because of her association with me. I thought about my Aunt Margaret, confused and frightened by people exploiting her vulnerability for their own purposes. I thought about the families who'd been driven from their church for refusing to participate in their persecution campaign. Do it. The media strategy we developed was sophisticated and comprehensive, designed to present the story in a way that would maximize public understanding while minimizing legal liability. Marcus arranged for interviews with a journalist who specialized in religious abuse investigations, someone with the expertise to understand the broader patterns of behavior our situation represented. The journalist, Rebecca Martinez, was a woman in her 40s who'd built her reputation exposing corruption and abuse within religious organizations across the American Midwest. She understood immediately that my story wasn't just about one person's conflict with their former church, but about the systematic use of religious authority to control and punish people who challenge traditional community boundaries. This type of harassment campaign is more common than people realize, Rebecca explained during our initial interview conducted via secure video link. Small religious communities often react aggressively when members achieve success that challenges their assumptions about proper life choice. The difference in your case is the resources you have available to document and resist their activity. She was particularly interested in the financial aspect of my story, both the anonymous funding I'd provided to save the church and the $12,000 they'd spent on surveillance operations, while claiming to oppose worldly materialism. The hypocrisy was obvious and compelling, exactly the kind of contradiction that made for effective investigative reporting. Religious organizations often preach about spiritual values while demonstrating remarkably materialistic motivations. Rebecca noted, "Your church spent significant money trying to destroy your career while accepting anonymous funding to solve their financial problems. That level of hypocrisy tends to resonate with readers who've experienced similar contradictions in their own religious community." The investigation took 3 weeks to complete, during which Rebecca interviewed multiple sources in Cedar Falls and documented the broader pattern of harassment and intimidation the church had employed. She spoke with former congregation members who'd been driven away, with local business owners who'd been pressured to condemn my lifestyle, and with community leaders who'd watched the church's campaign with growing concern. The resulting article was devastating in its precision and scope. Rebecca had crafted a narrative that exposed not just the specific actions taken against me, but the broader culture of control and judgment that made such actions possible. The headline read, "When Faith Becomes Persecution: How One Iowa Church's Moral Crusade Destroyed Its Own Community." The story detailed every aspect of their campaign: the surveillance operation, the attempted career sabotage, the systematic purging of dissenting voices, the manipulation of vulnerable elderly relatives, and the expansion of their activities beyond their own congregation. It also revealed the financial hypocrisy of people who condemned worldly success while depending on anonymous donations from the very person they were persecuting. But the most powerful element was Rebecca's broader analysis of how religious communities sometimes use spiritual language to justify fundamentally un-Christian behavior. She placed my situation within the context of similar cases across rural America, showing how economic anxiety and cultural change often manifested as religious persecution of community members who'd found success outside traditional boundaries. The article was published simultaneously in 3 regional newspapers and picked up by several national media outlets that specialized in religious and cultural issues. Within hours, it was being shared widely on social media platforms by people who recognized similar patterns in their own communities and religious experiences. The response from Cedar Falls was swift and predictable. Pastor Williams issued a statement condemning the article as anti-Christian propaganda and claiming that their activities had been misrepresented by biased reporting. He positioned himself and the church as victims of a smear campaign orchestrated by someone who'd abandoned her faith and was now using worldly power to attack religious freedom, but the damage was irreversible. The systematic documentation of their harassment campaign, combined with the revelation of the anonymous funding they'd accepted while persecuting their benefactor, made their claims of religious persecution impossible to sustain. Public opinion, even within conservative Christian circles, turned against them with surprising speed and intensity. More significantly, the article prompted investigations by both state and federal authorities into potential tax law violations related to the church's political activities and surveillance operations. Churches that engage in systematic harassment of private citizens risk losing their tax-exempt status, and Cornerstone Baptist's well-documented campaign against me provided clear grounds for such review. The collapse of their position was rapid and complete.
Within a month of the article's publication, Pastor Williams had resigned under pressure from denominational leadership, who were concerned about the negative publicity. 2 more board members had quit in disgust over the leadership's response to the crisis. Attendance had dropped to less than 30% of its previous level, and the church was facing serious financial difficulties, despite the anonymous funding I'd provided. Sarah called me from her new apartment in Des Moines, where she'd relocated with her children after successfully challenging her husband's divorce filing and custody claim. Her voice sounded different, stronger somehow, like someone who'd survived a trauma that had ultimately revealed her own resilience. "I never thought I'd say this," she told me, "but I'm grateful for what happened. Losing everything forced me to discover who I really was underneath all the expectations and judgments I'd been carrying my whole life. I'm terrified about the future, but I'm also excited about it in a way I haven't been since we were teenagers dreaming about escaping Cedar Falls." The irony was profound. Sarah had found her own version of liberation, through destruction, forced to rebuild her life outside the community constraints that had defined her for nearly 4 decades. Her trauma had become transformation, her exile had become freedom, her loss had become discovery of possibilities she'd never allowed herself to imagine. But the victory felt hollow and complicated. I'd succeeded in defending myself and protecting people like Sarah from further persecution, but I'd also contributed to the destruction of a community institution that had provided meaning and comfort to many innocent people. The church's collapse affected not just the leadership who'd orchestrated the harassment campaign, but also elderly members who'd depended on it for social connection and spiritual guidance. The moral calculus was impossible to resolve cleanly. I'd used my resources to fight back against people who'd systematically violated my privacy and threatened my livelihood, but in doing so I'd also damaged an organization that served legitimate needs for many people who'd had nothing to do with their leadership's vindictive campaign. James found me one evening sitting on our balcony, staring out at the lake while struggling with the ethical complexities of what we'd accomplished. He settled into the chair beside me with 2 glasses of wine, offering silent companionship while I processed the implications of our successful counterattack. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally, his question carrying genuine curiosity, rather than judgment. "I regret that it was necessary," I said after a long pause. "I regret that people I once cared about chose persecution over acceptance, destruction over understanding, but I don't regret defending myself and the people they were hurting in their campaign against me." "You couldn't have known it would escalate this far," James pointed out. "When you first left Iowa, you were just trying to build a better life for yourself. Everything that followed was their choice, their decision to make your success into their moral crusade." He was right, but the knowledge didn't entirely absolve me of responsibility for the consequences. My escape from Cedar Falls had triggered a series of events that ultimately destroyed the very community I'd once tried to serve faithfully. The church that had baptized me, that had provided comfort during my mother's final illness, that had been the center of my social and spiritual life for decades, was now collapsing under the weight of its own vindictive obsession. But there was also something liberating about finally being free from their judgment and interference. For the first time since leaving Iowa, I could live my life without looking over my shoulder, without wondering what new form their harassment might take, without feeling guilty for succeeding beyond their limited expectations. The text message that had started this entire confrontation seemed like it belonged to a different era, a relic from a time when I still cared about their approval and worried about their disappointment. Now their opinions felt irrelevant, their moral authority permanently undermined by their own actions. I was no longer the person who'd left Cedar Falls 3 years earlier, uncertain about her worth and apologetic about her ambition. I'd become someone who understood her own value, who was willing to fight for her right to exist without permission or explanation from people who preferred her small and manageable. The transformation was complete, but it had come at a cost that would take years to fully understand. I'd gained the world in biblical terms, but I'd lost something else in the process. The question was whether what I'd gained was worth what I'd given up, and whether the person I'd become was better than the person I'd. Looking out at the lights of Zurich reflecting off the lake, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd built through my own efforts and abilities, I thought the answer was probably yes, but the certainty I'd once felt about my choices had been complicated by the recognition that every significant decision creates casualties, that every transformation requires destruction of what came before. I was successful, independent, and free from the constraints that had limited my potential for so many years, but I was also isolated from the community that had shaped me, responsible for consequences I'd never intended, and forever changed by conflicts I'd never wanted to fight. The price of liberation had been higher than I'd expected, but it was a price I was ultimately willing to pay. The question now was what to do with the freedom I'd purchased, and whether the life I built with it would justify the cost of achieving it.